So thanks to Valid Performance for inviting me to do this webinar. Should anyone want to connect afterwards, I've left my contact information in the bottom left there. I'm pretty accessible either way, so whatever your preference is, I'm happy if you reach out. Also, Phil Graham-Smith, Stu Cormack, and myself will be doing a live Q&A. Truly humbled and excited to share the virtual stage with two legends in our field. But I'm happy to answer anything you may have specific to this talk at that time. But we will go ahead and dive right into our topic here, which is the considerations for athlete monitoring in skill-dominant sports. And the first kind of way to approach considerations is to ask a bunch of questions. Athlete monitoring is essentially a framework that allows us to answer questions, and so we need to start with what questions am I trying to answer. We might also be interested in how well can I describe my players. So that would refer mostly to like physical profiling. How well can I describe the environment? So that can be development or competitive, and that would refer to things like external workload. And if I want to impact performance, what does performance even mean? And as our discussion is going to be rooted in more skill-intensive sports, performance can be quite difficult to pin down, especially as it relates to physical characteristics. And then lastly, what changes or influences performance? So as practitioners in elite sport, it's great that we intimately understand performance, but we are oftentimes in the business of improving it. And so knowing what changes or influences it is equally as important. And athlete monitoring is essentially a process by which we can start to get answers to all of these questions. But I think athlete monitoring has two relatively distinct and rudimentary roles too. The first of which is to help us in fatigue management. And the second of which is the evaluation of program efficacy, which in skill-dominant sports that can look a lot different depending on the environment and the level of athlete and a lot of things in between. But before going further, I did want to talk about what I mean by skill dominant or skill intensive, and it's pretty intuitive, but I did want to spend some time here that at least in explaining why I believe it's important when we're constructing athlete monitoring processes to consider where we are at on this spectrum. And on the less skill intensive side, we have things like track and field and weightlifting. As we move through, we have American and Australian rules football. Right down the middle, we tend to have basketball, soccer, hockey. As we get on the more intensive, more skill-intensive side of the continuum, here we have the sport that I currently work with in baseball, but we also have MMA. And then at the very extreme end of being skill-intensive, we have golf and archery. And to me, this is really important as we construct an athlete monitoring process because of the very different ways that physical profiles come out with these respective sports. And so if we're on the left-hand side here with track and field, we would expect a great deal of physical profile homogeneity versus if we're talking about golf, you can even see with Tiger Woods and John Daly that there probably isn't a battery of tests on the planet that you could put them through that they would look similar. And so there's a great deal of physical profile heterogeneity on the skill-intensive side of things. And if we look at this briefly, though we're not going to spend a great deal of time on the kind of complex systems approach to look at performance, because so far we have been relatively rudimentary, you might see, for starters, fewer of these interactions or direct interactions with the less skill intensive. So if we have our web of determinants of these regularities of performance, if we compare the less skill intensive to the more skill intensive, you'll see more of these indirect interactions on the more skill intensive side. It's pretty logical there. And though my figure doesn't demonstrate it, we would probably also have more kind of factors or regularities included on the more skill intensive side, though for space limitations I actually actually ended up making them the same. But with the more physical dominant or less skill intensive, you could make a case that there are very likely fewer factors or regularities at play here. But our discussion needs to be rooted in something much simpler. And so we're going to distill performance again down to physical, technical, and tactical. And on the less skill-intensive end of the spectrum, obviously an overwhelming contribution from the physical. And on the more skill-intensive end of the spectrum, we have little contribution from the physical, but technical and tactical are going to drive the boat there. And then right down the middle, we just even everything out from a physical, technical, tactical standpoint. So if we consider most athlete monitoring processes, we tend to take this lens right here and we hunt down a term we're all familiar with, KPIs, key performance indicators. So these are essentially those measurable values that will influence sports success. They're a fundamental part of understanding what it takes to win. And an example here, I had the opportunity to work with one of the best speed coaches in the world in Dr. Brad DeWeese at our Olympic training site at East Tennessee State. And people come from all over the world. These bobsled push athletes come from all over the world to get faster. And they're interested in getting faster because if they get faster, that will almost certainly have a favorable effect on their push performance. And so that provides us a really good example of a KPI. If the athlete gets faster, we have a general idea of the competitive readiness or the preparation status of that athlete. KPIs are pretty clean in that regard, but in skill-intensive sports, we may be more concerned with potential restraint factors. And we can think of potential restraint factors as these latent barriers to better performance, and they can take on two primary forms. First, they may be non-specific qualities that either serve as prerequisites to further development, or they can help to preserve current status. And we'll unpack that a little bit. So if we just consider strength, so we're on the left-hand side here. If we consider strength, we can use strength to further mature an athlete's sprint acceleration abilities. And if we even narrow this to baseball, sprint acceleration would be a KPI for base stealing. And getting people stronger has been relatively well established in the literature as a way to improve acceleration abilities. So we are essentially targeting a physical prerequisite rather than directly targeting a KPI. So in a sense, a limited amount of strength is restraining that athlete's ability to get any faster. So by removing that barrier, we are allowing that athlete to raise their performance ceiling. From an injury risk perspective, so kind of an alternative look at these potential restraint factors, an athlete may need a functional minimum, and this is now hamstring strength, so they may need a functional minimum of strength to reduce injury risk. And reducing injury risk, another way to say that is to preserve health status. So therefore, insufficient strength in the hamstrings, it may actually interfere with an athlete's career trajectory due to the skill development time lost should they experience an injury. And so if they experience time loss, they have less time to get with our field staff, and they train at a lower quality, they compete less, which competition is the most representative development opportunity that we have. So it's really, really important that that health status is preserved. And I think targeting qualities that fit into the potential restraint factor bucket is a nice way to look at this when we are constructing athlete monitoring frameworks. And if we get back to the purpose of our talk here, the role of athlete monitoring, now we're ready to narrow our conversation into the fatigue management piece, and we might be concerned with the base rates of injury. We might be concerned with some internal workload, some external workload. We're going to lean really heavily on general scientific knowledge here, essentially boiling down to two things of what our process needs to be able to do for us, and that is to describe our sport better than everybody else. Secondly, we need to be able to describe the response to our sport better than everyone else, which is really going to directly influence our fatigue management strategies. But we need to be able to describe the sport because eventually we are going to have to manage those external workloads. But these two key pieces are what kind of manifest from a properly structured process and having very good questions to answer. And from the program efficacy standpoint, now we have some different things here. We have, maybe hamstring strength that we've got 2 tests for. You might be concerned with some movement quality pieces or movement capability pieces. You might have sprint speed or acceleration ability, one of those KPIs, and then you might have some general lower body or strength assessments that we lean on some of the Force platform technology for. But essentially, what we are aiming to do is to understand performance better than anyone else. And secondly, we are trying to identify what, and again, our role is generally narrowed to the physical. So we are trying to identify what physical qualities directly or indirectly change and influence performance. And then thirdly, we are trying to understand how to change and influence those qualities that are affecting performance outcomes. And that's all I've got for this one. Thank you very much for having me. And I like to conclude every talk by just giving a quick thank you to anyone who has worked very closely with me and influenced the way I go about my business on a day-to-day, but also my mentors, and both of which are displayed on the screen here. So special thanks to them because they have invested a great deal in me. So I want to be sure to take that moment at the end of this talk. So thanks, and look forward to talking to you guys at the live Q&A.